Now then, if you have a school pupil in the house, you will be all too aware of the challenges they've faced these past few years, from COVID lockdowns to online classes and rows over the big exams. Now, though, a very different type of disruption, as strikes have seen school gates locked across the country. The latest round of walkouts comes to an end tomorrow, but it's not over yet. There are more to come. So far, unions have rejected a 5% pay offer. They want a pay rise of 10%. But the government say they just don't have that kind of money, and creative solutions seem to be in short supply, with councils warned they'll be sued if they cut teacher numbers or classroom hours. Well, I spoke to the Education Secretary, Shirley-Anne Somerville, about all of this and more besides, and I started with perhaps the most obvious question: when might all this end?
Well, no one wants to see disruption in the schools, neither the Scottish Government, local government, or indeed our trade union colleagues as well. We have the real challenge, however, that we have a pay claim that's came in from trade unions for 10%, which is simply unaffordable for the Scottish Government and local government to be able to meet. So we need to be able to get around the table and compromise. Now, it would be fair to say at this stage we are still some way apart on what that is, and I'm afraid trade union demands at this point are not affordable for the government. So it is exceptionally unfortunate that we're still seeing teachers going on strike. They don't want to see that. We certainly don't want to see that, but we do need to see more compromise to ensure that we find something that is fair and is affordable.
Are you digging your heels in? You're being accused of digging your heels in.
Well, the financial reality is that the Scottish Government has a fixed budget that's already allocated and has been eroded by inflation. So I am dealing with the financial reality and the context which we're in, which will not change. The money that we have available is the money that we have available, and that's why we need to work very creatively with trade union colleagues to see if we can find a way through this.
So you're not prepared to compromise?
We're very prepared to compromise.
Well, can you give me an example of any area in which you have compromised in recent months to try and move this on and find a solution?
So local government as the employers, with investment from the Scottish Government, have now made 4 offers to the teacher unions. Now, I appreciate that all of them have been rejected. That is their right, and they have a mandate to carry strike.
And the unions say they've barely changed in the last 6 months, those offers, since August. They say they've had 4 meetings with you since November, where virtually nothing has happened at all. We're getting a very clear image of 2 sides sitting across the table, folding their arms and just staring at each other, while kids are locked out of schools.
Well, we had further meetings this week I had directly with trade unions where, yes, there is a lot that we disagree on, but we still need to get round that table to try and find ways to compromise. The reality I'm in this year is there is only a set amount I can do with the budget that we have within the entirety of the Scottish Government, which is already allocated. So while I'm very sympathetic, absolutely, to the work of teachers, absolutely everything that they did during COVID to help our children and young people in the most difficult of circumstances, there is a financial reality we are in this year that cannot change, and that is the challenge that we have.
There are no more negotiations planned, are there?
Well, I met with trade unions last week. I've suggested at that time that I think we should meet again next week and that they can meet with government officials to go through in detailed discussions. And I think it's really important that we get round the table. We're not at the point of being able to put an offer together yet because we still are some way apart. But unless we're in the same room as each other, unless we're having those types of discussions in private to see where we can find compromise, we will not find a way through this. So my offer to them has been once again to meet with officials next week to try and go through those detailed discussions in private to see what can be done.
But if you're not going to make any kind of improved offer, and that's what they say they're finding, months after month after month, where's the solution to this? There's no end in sight. How do you see this ending?
Well, I think we are very much trying to see how we can do an improved offer and how we can do things innovatively. I've been asked by trade unions specifically not to get into the details of what that might look like, and I respect their wish for me not to discuss that in public.
Are you both working off the same idea, though?
We're looking at a variety of ideas.
So there are green shoots there?
Well, I would certainly be very, very hopeful that we are round the table and we are discussing. Now, I will not attempt to be over-optimistic on this because, as I've said, we are some distance apart when it comes to the actual funding of it.
Do you think this will be done before the exams start?
Well, this is very important that we get this resolved as soon as possible. It does nobody any good for this to drag on, and we're very keen for that to happen. Now, of course, trade union colleagues, they have their mandate to strike, and I absolutely respect that. But what we could see as we've seen in other sectors, is a suspension and no further strike dates while talks are continuing. Now, I've asked trade unions to look at that. They've so far refused to do that, but I think particularly as we move forward to exam season, I would like them to consider that. Now, obviously, I want to get this dispute resolved before then, but if that's not the case, then I think that's very important that as we're continuing discussions, there is some discussion within the trade unions about suspending their action.
Could this industrial action impact the exams?
I don't think it should.
No,
Well, I don't think it should, and I think that's very much up to the trade union.
Well, they would say it's up to you to resolve the dispute.
Yes, and in the financial reality that we're in, we will absolutely endeavour to do that. One of the aspects which I'm very, very determined to ensure is that children and young people have very limited disruption to their education going forward. The exams is a critical part of that. Now, I would hope that everyone involved in this dispute would be able to agree that we do not want to see exams disrupted. Now, of course, as you would expect, the Scottish Government is working with local government and with the SQA to ensure that we have contingencies in place if trade union colleagues decide to move forward with anything which would disrupt exams. But I would like to think, for the benefit of children and young people and parents right across the country, that it wouldn't be too difficult for trade unions to say that, no, we absolutely respect children and young people's right to be able to carry out their exam and not have any threat to that hanging over them.
Can you give a guarantee that there's a contingency in place so exams will not be disrupted?
Well, that's absolutely what we're working with.
But can you give a guarantee?
That's absolutely what we are working towards to ensure that that happens. However, I would say we can ensure that those contingencies are not required by the trade unions simply stating that yes, they'll carry on strike action, they may carry on action short of strike, but what they would not do is do anything to threaten exams, and that just takes away the worry. So we'll put in the contingencies in place, of course we will, but I think there is also an opportunity for everyone to be able to reassure people that there'll be nothing that they should even remotely worry about that would touch their exams.
There are parents out there who are taking days off work that they can ill afford, many of them presumably earning less than the teachers, on every day of strike action so they can look after their kids. Can you say with a clear conscience to those parents that you are doing everything you possibly can do to get this resolved as quickly as it possibly can be?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have continued the discussions. We are some way apart when it comes to the numbers, but unless we keep getting around the table, we're never going to find a way through this. We're absolutely determined to do that.
Why don't you take this back under central control? Why don't you get rid of the charade, actually, that local councils deal with education when you tell them what to do in so many other regards, and just deal with it yourself?
Well, I think we have to respect the fact that councils are elected and they are there to make their decisions. An example.
We had Coslow's head of resources on last week who said 65% of the money that they get in their budget is already accounted for. That could have gone up to 70% given the extra amount that the demands that you're making as of this week about teachers.
Well, let me give you one example of how actually what we've tried to do is very much empower not local authorities but actually head teachers. So there's over £520 million of pupil equity funding going in from the government to be able to assist with tackling the attainment gap that goes directly to head teachers. Now, yes, there's broad national guidance, but it's actually up to head teachers, not even local authorities, about how that money's spent. So yes, it's about tackling poverty-related attainment, but it's up to head teachers about how to do this.
You're threatening to sue or fine councils who don't do what you're telling them to do with the money.
For when it comes to the money that we've put into the budget for additional teachers and support staff, we had an agreement at the start of the financial year that we're currently in. The £145.5 million would go in, and for that we would see actually an increase in teacher numbers and support staff, and particularly also a change from temporary to permanent contracts. Now, that was an agreement we made. When it comes to this year, the money is remaining in the local government budget, but there have been reports, and they are still reports because councils have not made their budget decisions yet, that we would see a reduction in teacher numbers and indeed reductions in support staff numbers. I don't think it's surprising that if the government is putting money in with a specific purpose, which we have a shared endeavour about, tackling the poverty-related attainment gap, that we would wish to see the money being spent for the reasons that it was given.
Listen to this quote. This government will reduce ring fencing, enabling councils to allocate resources according to local priorities. We recognise the democratic legitimacy of local government to make decisions that reflect local needs. Do you know who said that?
I'm going to presume it was the First Minister.
It was, well, nearly. It was John Swinney, 2007, signing what's become known as the historic Concordat between councils and the Scottish Government, the day after the SNP took office. What happened between then and now, where we're told that 60% of the money that's handed to them, 2/3 of it, is already taken care of before they get hold of it?
So the
Do you trust them?
The aspect around the 145.5 million is a good case in point, I think, with this. At the start of the financial year we're currently in, there was a discussion between Scottish Government and local government about how that money should be spent, and an agreement that for that we should see additional teachers and support staff, and we should also see an increase in the number for permanent. That didn't happen. We didn't ring fence it, and it wasn't used in the way that we agreed. It wasn't like it was put in and I dictated. We agreed, and that didn't happen. I don't think it's surprising that we try an alternative approach to ensure that we get that money.
It just feels like a lack of trust, though, doesn't it? And a lack of respect. They're seeing it as a significant and specific lack of respect.
Well, I appreciate that. And what I've said to Geissler very openly is, if during this financial year they had realised that they may not achieve what we had jointly agreed that we were going to achieve, my door was always open for that to be brought to my attention and for us to decide other ways to spend the money. On the basis those types of discussions don't happen, again, I don't think it's surprising we look for alternatives. But I think there is an absolute lesson that we may need to move on this 145, and we may need to look at a ring fence and some aspect around that. But I think it has, and it is a lesson that we will use with local government to say, how can we get this to work better in the future? Because we do want to see a reduction in ring fencing overall and more flexibilities to councils.
Talking of Scottish Government policy and SNP party discipline and expectations, should SNP politicians who don't agree with the Scottish Government stance on gender recognition reform, for example, or other areas, resign from the party?
Well, we all stood in a manifesto that was obligated to look at improving the trans community's life chances and life circumstances, and particularly around gender recognition. I think if we stand on a manifesto for that, there's an expectation as any representative of any political party that you follow that manifesto through.
If you don't agree with it, wherever you are in the party, if you're an elected SNP politician and you don't agree with it, resign.
Well, if you stand in a manifesto, we all stand in manifestos, and we all stand as SNP representatives. That SNP symbol is beside our name. It's the same for every political party. We're all there representing a political party. So I think it's up to individual members as we go through their stage as elected members, that they may wish to take decisions that are against that manifesto. They can do that. Political parties have that. They should then question about whether it is comfortable being in a party where you pick and choose the policies after you've been re-elected.
So Joanna Cherry should resign from the SNP?
I don't think people should resign from the SNP.
Alan Smith does. That's specifically what he said. Go and stand as an independent, see how you get on. Or as an individual, he said, see how you get on.
And at an election, I think that's a fair point. So if you're standing as an SNP candidate at an election on a manifesto, you should stand on that manifesto and you should follow that through. At the next election, you can of course then decide if you wish to be an SNP candidate.
So Joanna Cherry, Ash Regan, whoever, out at the next election?
That is entirely up to them about whether they wish to
but
put themselves...
They should, judging by this?
No, I'm not, and I haven't actually said that. What I'm saying is, if they wish to stand as an SNP candidate and their branch and their constituency wish to have them, then they have to stand as SNP candidates on a manifesto with an expectation that they'd follow that through.
We now know from an interview he gave this week that the Prime Minister thinks biological sex is important. Do you?
Well, I think what's really unfortunate about what the Prime Minister said on a variety of issues is that I don't hear anything coming out in support of the trans community. One of the most marginalised communities in the UK
I'm asking if you think biological sex is important. He says he did.
And he's perfectly entitled to that position. What I think is exceptionally difficult, from what I've seen of all of this discussion from the UK government, is there is not a reassurance to the trans community that they are respected. There's not a reassurance to the trans community that they are valid and that they are a valued part of our community. And I really wish Prime Minister can say what he wants about a variety of issues. If you've got a marginalised...
What's your answer to my question, though? Do you think it's important?
Well, it's important that we have discussions about biological sex.
Right, okay.
It's important, but very importantly, there are individuals who may be born as a man, who may want to transition as female, or indeed we see many people that are born as women who believe actually they're in the wrong body and they should be male. And we also need to respect that. This is always happened. This is not new, but what we're trying to tackle now is society's willingness to accept and value the trans community. And so when the Prime Minister talks about biological sex, I wish he'd start talking about respect for the trans community too.
Do you think this debate has made it more difficult for the trans community?
I think it's exceptionally difficult for members of the trans community, and I've spoken to them.
Now more perhaps than ever, because they're right at the centre of a massively divisive discussion.
And they have been for some time now, and I think that is exceptionally difficult for them. What has happened in the past, for example, when the pushback around Section 28, for example, some of the language which we're seeing against the trans community was used against gay men, against lesbians in the past. So there is always a difficulty as we move forward with things. Responsibility for government, I think, is to take tough decisions, but to do that respectfully and to ensure that we're reassuring where at all possible. But I think you're right. I think it is exceptionally difficult for people in the trans community just now, and that's why it is important that we do hold firm in our support to ensure that, yes, we reassure everyone in this aspect, but that we continue on the path to make sure that part of our community that has some of the highest suicide rates, highest rates of self-harm, highest rates of mental health issues, that somebody is there to support them, and that's what government should do.
Shirley-Anne Somerville there talking to me just a little bit earlier than in the weekend. Well, let's get back to those negotiations over the teachers' strike. What is it like inside the room? I was trying to get an idea from her on this. Let's speak to somebody who's actually in the room as well on the other side. Des Morris is the salaries convener for the Teachers' Union, the EIS, and one of the negotiators. Morning, Des. Thanks very much for being with us.
Morning.
Nothing much new in any of this. That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, as I said to Shirley-Anne Somerville, I'm getting the impression of two sides sitting with their arms folded, just glowering at each other. Would that be far from the truth?
Well, I think the problem, Martin, is that there has been a complete lack of urgency on the part of both Scottish Government and Geissler in efforts to settle this dispute. We signalled clearly our intention back in March of last year that we would be balloting for industrial action should our pay claim not be settled in October. Now, I've gone back and checked my diary, and I've counted only 2 formal pay meetings as having taken place between the 18th of August and the 24th of November, which was the date of our first industrial action.
And this is all about pay?
All about pay. And, you know, given that timeline and lack of inaction, our pay claim was submitted a year ago. We waited 3 months to be offered 2% in May. We waited a further 3 months to be offered 5% in August. And 6 months later, to all intents and purposes, nothing has changed. So I think it's actually no surprise, and should come as no surprise, that our members are out in picket lines in defence of their pay.
Are the Scottish Government and Geissler acting in good faith?
Well, this is one of the other issues, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to reconcile recent statements from Scottish Government ministers with what's actually happening, as you say, in the room. So over the course of January, we've heard a number of statements, such as no stone being left unturned to find resolution, offering to look at all options, statements that there have to be compromises on both sides, that the Scottish Government is not digging in its heels. But these statements have all culminated. They culminated in our 20th of January pay meeting, the last pay meeting that was held, when basically the message was, teachers, see that 5% offer we offered you 6 months ago, take it or leave it.
Right. Now, I mean, she's saying...
But man, if that's not digging your heels in, then I really don't know what is.
OK, she's saying we're looking at an improved offer. We can do things creatively, innovatively, but I've been asked by the unions not to discuss what that might look like. Quote. Do you recognise that?
Well, no, I mean, that's news to me. The 20th of January was our last pay meeting. Now, it's not an unreasonable proposition to say that in formal negotiations there should be compromise on both sides. But what is an entirely unreasonable proposition is that all that compromise should come from one side.
So they're not bending. They're not compromising. She says they're prepared to compromise. They're working on it. You're saying they're not.
Well, in the interview you've just played with the Cabinet Secretary, she says that further compromise is needed. But I'm sitting here telling you that when we last met on the 20th of January, the absolute clear message from Geissler and the Scottish Government was 5%, that 6-month deal, take it or leave it. The November deal the November 22nd November pay offer is to all intents and purposes the same as the August one. So nothing has happened for 6 months.
Crucially, for the sake of the pupils and their parents, let's look at exams. She says you can give a guarantee. It's very easy. You just guarantee you won't do anything that will impact exams. Will you give that guarantee?
Well, I think the very fact that actually you're asking that question just shows the urgency of the situation in getting this matter resolved.
Will you? You can just say we won't strike in the summer term.
It's not for me to. It's not for me to say that because
well, it is. Isn't it? You're acting on behalf of the union.
Well, I'm the salaries convener, but it's for.
Do you think the union will offer a guarantee they won't strike in the summer?
It's for our executive committee. Keeps our industrial action strategy under constant review, as you would expect.
You're not ruling out that this might impact the exams, are you?
Well, I mean, we want this dispute resolved as quickly as possible and in as timely a manner as possible. But we keep our industrial action strategy under review. The dates that we have are set out. They are they're publicly available. But as I say, it is up to Scottish Government and Geissler to back up their public statements about compromise and movement actually with actions that match that in the room.
We're hearing very similar noises from both sides. Des Morris from the EIS, thanks very much indeed for being with us this morning on the Sunday Show.
See the unfiltered side of social media.
No way.
At Scotland's biggest influencer agency.
No crying. I can't promise you that. She won't cancel, will she? She can't cancel.
The agency